I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to The Conversation with Al McFarlane. I'm glad to be here and glad to have you along as well. Today is Thursday, March 23rd, 2023. Happens to be my mom's birthday, so I'm wishing her happy 97th. We in family say, she's always said 99 and a half won't do. She's trying to make 100, so we wish and expect and are calling for that to materialize minute by minute, day by day. Happy birthday, Mom. I think it's your birthday this month too, right, Irma? Aren't you an Aries as well? You're in the background. Well, when you come in, I'll I'll ask you that same question. Well, today we want to focus on an article about identity and about culture. It's an article written by our colleague, our culture and education editor, Dr. Irma McClaurin, who's a noted anthropologist, author, photographer, activist, philosopher, everything. Irma McClaurin is just a superb human being and delivers that quality of intensity, of thoughtfulness, and sharpness in all of her work. We're pleased to have her on board our team. And she's written an article that's featured in the upcoming edition of Insight News. It's on the website already, that questions how people form identity. I'll ask her to explain that as she goes into the article. Before we do that, let me invite you to support this work, support this conversation by going to our YouTube channel, Insight YouTube Insight, and subscribe, like, and share. We want to get this connection, this network of YouTube friends, followers, members, subscribers up to 1,000. That's our short-term goal. We've just crossed the 300 threshold. That was our immediate short-term target. Our immediate short-term target now is 400 on route to getting 1,000 subscribers. Subscribing costs you nothing. It simply means you get notified and you get invited to follow and contribute to, with your thoughts and ideas and your presence, these important discussions. So take a minute. You may be connecting with us right now on the NNPA YouTube channel. We thank you for being there. You may be connected to us on Twitter, on Facebook, or on LinkedIn. Wherever you are, stay there. Thank you for being there, but take a minute, jump over to YouTube Insight and subscribe. Help us grow this to 1,000. It's our goal, but right now we want to go from 300. We just crossed that to 400, and you can play a part in doing that. Well, let's go to our guest today. Dr. Irma McClaurin is here, but also our colleague from Bahia, Maestri Yoji Senna, who is editing our project that we call Afrodescendientes. And today's program is particularly interesting because Irma's raising the question in an article that is entitled Hispanics and Latinos Beware. Becoming race or a race is not all that. Again, that's one of the lead stories in Monday's edition of Insight News, Monday coming, but it's online today at insightnews.com. Irma, let me just go straight to you and ask you to set up, tell the story, the background, and what are the things you're asking us all to look at, think about in the question of race, and particularly about Hispanics, Latino, Latinx. What does it mean in this country and even around the world? Good afternoon, Irma.
Hi, very good to be here. And yes, please subscribe. I think it's important for people to understand that that in the United States Census, when they count people and they count people by groupings, it has been a way to garner resources for communities. And what has happened is that as we have had more immigrant come in who are not white, the census is always struggling with how does it count them? So there is a move underfoot by the Office of Business Management, OBM, to change the census categories in the next census, which is in 2030, I believe. What that will do is actually confuse. It will then be impossible to go back and compare because if the categories change. But the most important part of this is the term Hispanic is a construction. It is not a real place. There is no country called Hispanic. There is no continent called Hispanic. It was invented by the United States for the census purpose. And what has happened is that when people use that category, those people who do not self identify as white Hispanic, because there are some Latin Americans who identify as white of Spanish ancestry, but there are also a huge population of African descendants and indigenous people. Those people often put Hispanic and then other. And the Census Bureau, as I'm understanding it, is having a difficult time of trying to, uh, classify what that means. This decision to make Hispanics, Latinos a race, however, has all kinds of implications. It will homogenize what is an entire continent of people because Latin America is made up of multiple countries. Those countries have different populations and diversity within that population. I think Yogi will tell us that over 50% of Brazil are people have African ancestry. Peru, 12% of the population are people who are African descendant. And this is the United Nations decade of Afro Descendentes. So at the same time that the United Nations is declaring that we need to recognize people of African descent outside of the United States, but all over the world, the United States is trying to homogenize them into one group. And those people who are Latin Americans, who are Afro descendants, are saying this will erase us. This will actually diminish our political power. And that it's part of an enterprise on the part of Blancamientos, white Latinos, to sort of undermine, to sort of make themselves into this homogenous category, which it's not. And I think we need to understand that in context of Latin America, their process of racialization was different. They engaged in a process called blanqueamiento, which is whitening up. They actually recruited Europeans to come to Latin American countries and whiten the population. In the United States, it was the reverse. One drop of black blood, regardless of what your mixture was, made you black. So we've got these two different categories. So when people come to this country, even if they're born in this country, they inherit a history of racialization that is somewhat different, but still puts blacks at the very bottom and disenfranchises them. And I think the most important thing is that race is a construct. It's presumed to be some sort of biological thing. Human variation, how we look different, our hair texture, all of that, that is real. But the idea of race is a social construct that has been invented in order to classify people, with whites being at the very top and considered to be the most important, and blacks and indigenous people at the very bottom, and then a sort of graduation in between that. So that's it in a nutshell. And there's a huge Afro Latino response in which they're saying, no, you can't do that to us. And they're really challenging this, and they're asking people to go to the OMB website before April 12th and to voice their dissent to not make this change. And part of the problem is that OMB is saying it's confusing. It's not confusing to Latin Americans. They can be both considered a race and an ethnicity because ethnicity is about culture and language, right? And so they put both categories down. And rather than have that kind of disaggregation, what they want to do with Hispanics, okay, is to homogenize it into one group. Alongside that, Middle Easterners are asking to be taken out of the white category and made into a separate ethnic group. So they actually want to be an ethnic, right? And they want to be taken out of the white category. So it's like the OMB is considering that for them, but it's doing the reverse for Latinos. And Afro Latinos are saying they're not going to tolerate that. They want something different.
Well, let's go walk back through. You mentioned several groups where this has been a concern. You mentioned, for example, the Irish, and you mentioned Cubans, you mentioned Jews. Let's talk about their experiences, our country's experience, and what's the right word for it, in embracing or in absorbing those ethnicities. from the point of view of within those ethnicities and from the point of view of the overall social structure. What was the intent of the government in deciding, what was white and what was not white, and how they did variations on the theme. I mean, you know, when I talk to people I'm around, here in Minnesota, they're German, they're Irish, they're Dutch, Italian, French, and you know, but at the same time, I know they see themselves as white, right? But they don't want to say white. They're sometimes embarrassed if they're called white, but they're more embarrassed if they're not called white,
That's right.
and so it's the kind of thing that they can use at their leisure, at their pleasure, to consolidate, solidify power, prestige, right? And it's an understanding, a system that they both have created and that they maintain to their advantage. So, what about uh, Irish people being white or not white? What about Jews being white or not white? What about um, Cubans, the recent example, Cubans in Miami being white or not white, or simply Cubans being not black? That's kind of more the story. And in my Caribbean experiences back in the early days, when I went to Jamaica a lot, Jamaicans would say, we're not concerned about race here. Everybody's equal, and we don't see ourselves as black or as white. We're just Jamaicans, which I thought was pure garbage, right? Uh, and lying, because the society was organized around color and
Color,
around
yeah.
race.
And class, absolutely.
So what's the national social arrangement, and how do these ethnicities find ways to find advantage by claiming or by denying and abusing others who are perceived as lower down on the pecking order? What do you think?
Well, I mean, what you've done is to sort of give us an example of how complicated racialization, how to make people different and value the differently is, and that it changes over history. So in the United States Census, at one point, there was no category called Black. People were Negro, but they also had we were once colored, okay? And so these categories change. And what has happened in the census is that we have now associated not just counting people so we know how many citizens we have, but counting people in terms of getting strategic resources. In historical times, and I'm talking the 1930s, when you had massive European immigration, and particularly after World War II, the Irish were actually considered a race by themselves. They were not white, they were not black, they were just the Irish race. And there was a prohibition against them coming into this country. If you will remember, the controversy around Kennedy, John F. Kennedy running for president, is that he was Irish and Catholic, and those were considered very bad things to be. Well, over time, there's a book about how the Irish became white because they do carry white skin privilege. Some of them changed their names. I know people who changed names where they anglicized it. It became less Jewish recognizable and became more sort of, because white was considered to be white Protestant, right? And so they whitened their names and then they passed into the white category. And eventually that became an acceptable thing. The same thing happened to Irish, that as they gained more political power, more economic power, they became white. And in some ways, that actually is one of the enterprises of Latin America, is that there is a saying that says money whitens, so that you may carry a black skin, but if you have enough money, you actually become an honorary white person in Latin America. So at some point, there are two books, How Jews Became White by Karen Brodkin, who's an anthropologist, and also How the Irish Became White. And those two books take us through the historical circumstances that allow that to happen. Well, the problem with Black people is that we can't change our skin color. So we can get more money, we can be born into an elite family, but at the end of the day, we can't change what we look like phenotypically. Now, we know that there are times in which people who did walk with white skin, who were identified as Black because they had one drop at least and possibly more. did in fact pass for white, passé blanc, you know. Um, and so there is a very complicated history, but we have to understand is that for Hispanics, and particularly those who were the Cubans who came after the Cuban Revolution, were mostly the white elite, white skin elites who trace their ancestry more closely to Spain as opposed to connection with African or indigenous. Those people came, and because they had financial and economic power, they created an enclave of political power, you know, in Miami. And actually were very much engaged in trying to undermine the Cuban Revolution and also to prevent Afro Cubans from coming, you know, to the country afterwards. They actually blocked them, they didn't support them. And those people from Cuba who were of African descent who attempted to come to this country were not welcome with the same open arms as the white Cubans were. Those white Cubans have since gone on and gained tremendous power. I taught a number of their children when I was at the University of Florida. And so me and my sort of, you know, Pan-African, you know, people of color, we didn't have that term, but multicultural political perspective, I am doing a roll call and I'm calling them De Silva and Rodriguez, and I'm trying to like pronounce the names, and they're turning around and anglicizing their names and telling me that's not how they pronounce it. So that whitening of Cubans, especially, then translate it down into their children, even though their children were born. So those children see themselves as white. They don't see themselves. And if you notice on the census, if it says Black, not Hispanic, comma, white. So Hispanic is by default a white category. Mm-hmm. So people will use that on the census because it also is connected to culture and language. And then they may also check Black, or they may check mixed, or they may check others, because Latin America is in fact made up of tremendously diverse communities of indigenous. There's some Asians, there are lots of people of African descent. Every country in Latin and Central America had African slaves at some point or another, even though they may present themselves like Argentina as if they're completely of European origins. They actually have indigenous and Black. And that's also the book that I mentioned by Sheila Walker, who has gone around and documented in places, countries like Uruguay, Paraguay, Ecuador, that we don't usually associate with having people of African descent. There were, in fact, people of African descent there.
So let me review the consequence of the activity that you are raising the question about in the article. When you say beware, race isn't all that. Crystallize that idea again. What do you want us to think about? I mean, the country in general, but people who see themselves as Hispanic or Latino, Afro-Latino, what's your message?
So ethnicity is about culture and language, okay? Whereas race is about biology. There is embedded in the belief of race that the characteristics that people have are immutable. That is, they're unchangeable. Once you're racialized, you are now being put into a history of oppression, where if you are not of the quote unquote white race, you are always going to be seen as subordinate, as less than. And what I'm saying to Hispanics is that Black people have spent almost 400 years since the invention of slavery to try and eradicate this notion of race as a real thing. It's not real. It has no association with biology. There's no gene that makes you Black race or white race. What we are seeing is human variation, which is that because of geography and how people have migrated from Africa into European countries, hair color change, skin color change, and adaptation, you know, to their environment. But there's nothing that says that a white European is more intelligent than a Black person, except education and access to resources. Now, among every group, there are always those people who are geniuses. They can be artistic geniuses, intellectual geniuses. We know of them. We see them all the time. But that has nothing to do, okay, with race in that sense. And so I think it's very important. What I'm saying is that If you allow this to happen, you're actually putting yourself into a classification system that we have been trying to abandon for decades now, centuries. There's a whole exhibition that's actually at the Science Museum of Minnesota.
Hmm.
They were the ones who helped to build it. It was established by the American Anthropological Association, called Race, Are We So Different? Question mark. And it traces the history of how this concept, because it's a concept, how this concept of race came to be. And it looks at it within the American context. What I'm saying is that there's another context in Latin America that evolved simultaneously, but in slightly different paths. Instead of saying one drop makes you black, in Latin America, what they wanted to do was whiten the race and invite Europeans to come in. So actually, white Americans who did not win the Civil War actually went to Latin America. There are people who consider themselves still part of the Confederacy in places like Costa Rica. I know a few got to Belize. They found the climate so inhospitable. Some died, some left, but there's a small number who actually remain there. So, this idea of whitening and people going someplace where whiteness is valued, which is what Latin America is something that actually happened. If we change the census data, it's going to confuse all the counting that's been done historically. It's going to sort of collapse into one category in which Hispanic is presumed to be white. And according to a Pew study from the Pew Center for Research, approximately 25% of Latinos, 25% of the Latinos identify as people of African descent. 25%. That figure will get lost
Hmm.
if it becomes one big group, if it becomes a racial group, because then is the racial group a mixed group? Is there such a thing as a mixed race? Not in that classification system. There were categories of white, Caucasoid, which is an invention, African or Negroid, Mongoloid, which was Asian. There were Native Americans, and that was it. There were those categories, and people have been trying to get rid of those and saying they don't make sense because they're associated with intelligence. They're associated with whether one was civilized or primitive. And
Hmm.
people have been trying to get rid of us relying so much on those classifications. And now we're going to add another category to it. It just doesn't make sense.
And so the question is, what is our role in this? What is the call to action that you are, bringing today, Dr. Irma? What and how ought we be thinking about discussing and planning to protect what we identify as our interest, our identity, and our path to continual becoming uh, in a way that reflects our best humanity? What do you think?
Well, I think we have to join alliances with Afro Latinos and understand that they can be both an ethnic and be perceived as a race if that helps them to get counted. Because in many countries, the census in places like Panama and other places are only just now beginning to actually count Blackness, people of African descent, as a legitimate category, which is then allowing them to manifest their political power. Many of them have maintained their citizenship while they are in the United States. They don't want to suddenly be lost because they can't say we're 25% of the Hispanic population if Hispanic becomes a race and there's no differentiation. So we need to support them in their efforts. We need to protest the changing of the census because it's really a bureaucratic change. OBM is saying it does not want to, or OMB is saying it can't quite figure out what the categories are, so we just change the categories. Those are statisticians, okay? They're not social scientists. They haven't really engaged, from what I understand, the Afro Latino population in the discussion. And the Black folks who are sitting on those committees, if they don't understand the history of how racialization occurs in Latin America, they may be supporting something that doesn't make any sense.
Let's bring Yoji in. Yoji, if you're set or ready to come in, love to have you jump in the conversation. You're there in Bahia, and we talk all the
Yeah.
time about the question of identity. About in Brazil now, over 50% of the population sees itself as Afro Brazilian, right? And so, what does this discussion about culture, about ethnicity, about race, about blackness and whiteness mean in the context of the lives of the people of Brazil and of Bahia?
Well, uh, thank you for having me again. And I want to first give an opinion because I have answered the questions of the American Census a few times. And about the question of Hispanic and Latino, that, for example, when we do mention the Latino American world, Brazil is the biggest population, and we do not speak Spanish. So we technically are not Hispanic, and we do are Latino in the United States. And in the last census, they added, as do they have Hispanic, they do now have the Luso category that are for people that come from countries from Portuguese-speaking languages, and that encircles Brazil as well, Portugal, and in Angola, uh, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé and Príncipe, Cabo Verde, Mozambique, and
Let me
some
jump in
people
first.
that comes from
You,
Goa
you,
and China.
let me jump in. So, make the distinction between Latin American or Latino and Hispanic. And particularly because you said, as Brazilians, Portuguese language based, we don't consider ourselves Hispanic. Talk about those distinctions,
Yeah,
if you would.
we that's a man is something that we encounter when we arrive to live in the United States. Those classifications here in Brazil, you know, those people that consider themselves white here, they come over there, and all of a sudden they're called Latinos. They do a very hard work to not be seen as Latinos.
Mhm.
But in the US, us as Brazilian, when we are in community, we do reject actually both of those classifications. But we are more, um, I would say, comfortable be called Latino, but not Hispanics. And because of that, there was some lobby because there's a community of Portuguese speaking countries that they lobby. So now, as there is this Hispanic, there is the Luso. You know that Luso, it's an adjective for Portuguese because they used to be called Lusitania. So, and also, but the other thing is that's interesting is when, because also Hispanic and Latino, the general vision that we comes to our mind is people from south of the border. So, from Mexico down, and we have countries that speaks French, like Haiti, Martinique, and Guyana, uh, that they are not considered Latinos because Latino also is based on Latin languages. Is
Mhm.
not, and it's very interesting. Like Guyana, that is in South America, they are considered Caribbean. So all this classification in the U.S. it's very confusing. And as I know that Egyptians are classified as white,
Mm-hmm.
Tunisians, even though they have the same color as me. So, but Ethiopia, that's border with Egypt, they are already black. So in Brazil, the racial is changing in a certain way because there used to be many different subcategories of being black, right? Historically, people use the term mulatto. that we all know
Mhm.
the connotations, but was used as a form of to be less offensive than call somebody straight uh, negro. So in
Mhm.
Brazil now there is a distinction because, for example, in the United States we are called black people. So black is the color black, like in the spectrum of colors.
Mhm. Mhm.
Where in Brazil as influence from the American civil rights movement, we called them ourselves negros and preto, that is the equivalent of black, was we would remark that is the color. Like that car is black because it has the color black. Your T-shirt is black.
Mhm.
A sua camisa é preta.
Mhm.
But nowadays they are kind of reclaiming to call ourselves pretos. Some Hispanic countries do call black people prietos. Particularly that I have knowledge is Peru, but in the other ones it's called negros. And negros are also called the Indians in many of those countries. The indigenous people are called negro or cabecitas negras. So what is when here in Brazil is changing to because of this awareness has become more widespread about uh, being black and the political power, as you said earlier, that brings has also uh, creating this response from uh, those people that consider themselves white. For example, me coming from the US, having lived there so many times, most people here who claim themselves to be white, I identify as the typical Latino in the United States. That for me is the mix of indigenous and Europeans,
Mhm.
you know. But again, the mix, the people, they are mix of Europeans and indigenous people. They do the biggest effort to forget their
Mhm.
indigenous.
That's right.
They
So when
claim
you
the
say mix
Italian, they claim.
of Europeans and indigenous, for example, is that how you would generally broadly classify Chicanos, Mexican people, and Mexican Americans in particular? Is that too specific, or is that
No,
in the right?
Mexico is a particular case that also Mexico uh, is indigenous, and the majority of the Mexicans I encounter in Minnesota, uh, that they are indigenous. They are detribalized. They have been detribalized. They've been taken away from them the 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 the, the knowledge that they were once a people with particular culture and a tribe. Nowadays there's a movement of reclaiming also among younger Mexicans their
You said
aspects roots. You
you called it
see in this
detribalized.
place.
Detribalized. Is that what
Yeah,
you said? Yeah.
yeah, detribalization was the system used by the Jesuits for education of the indigenous people, particularly in South America, where in the area where is the southwest of Brazil, north of Argentina, bigger part of Paraguay. In the 1600s, the Jesuits created a virtual. It was part of a communist country that was seen as a threat by the Spanish and the Portuguese country because the Jesuits responded directly to the Pope, and and then the method of that they used was detribalization. So they took indigenous people from different tribes that could
And
be in close geographical proximity, but they were different culture or they speak different languages or a variation of the dialect. So they took them from the tribe they brought to called the misiones, the missions. That there's a movie, I about it. So that when they become detribalized, that were the seed of the beginning of many of those cities and those countries. They were Jesuit missions, so they're very organized. The houses or the communities in grids, square grids. They would start to do agriculture, and the idea of the gaucho, for example, the as the cowboy
Hmm.
of the south, is the detribalized Indian that after the destruction of the Jesuit missions, they start to roam freely through the pampas and but in already mixed or starting to be mixing with the Europeans that arrived.
The term
They were
mezcla,
arriving.
right?
So, or
Yeah,
mestizo, it's mestizo mezcla, but I think he's right in that, what begins to get privileged under the Jesuits is becoming more Europeanized, right? And taking away the indigenous language and culture, but the actual ancestry, the human variation part of it is very much rooted in indigenous people. And I think for in the United States, what people need to understand is that we did not embrace the cultural identity of Blackness as a color. We embraced it as a political identity. And so under that are subsumed people who range in terms of what they look like in terms of their phenotype. You have light skinned Blacks who have blonde hair and blue eyes who identify as Black. You have people of mixed ancestry, more contemporary, because by definition, African Americans are a mixed race. Something like less there are very few African Americans who can trace their ancestry to 100% African. Very few of us,
Mhm.
because we mixed with Native Americans. With Black women were raped under slavery on the slave ships, and so that produced a group of people who were a hybrid people historically. Then you have the more newer formations of, one person who identifies as Black, another who identifies as white, who then have a child. That child is now saying, I'm mixed, right? But some of them have actually said, I choose to self identify as Black. That's where I
my
want my
kid.
identity to be. So it's not just about color, it's about political identity. And we came together because we understood was embracing that political identity was now going to give us access to resources. And I find it interesting, Yoji, that at the time that the census is allowing for Luso to become a category separate because of language differences, distinct, that they now want to take all the different countries in what is a continent and lump it into one racial category. That's the contradiction, is that on the one hand, they're willing to do this kind of separation for people who speak Portuguese and for those who are of Middle Eastern descent who are saying, or North saying, I don't belong in the white category. They're going to make them into an ethnic group. Whereas they're going to take Afro descendant Latinos who come from different countries. They're from Panama, they're from Ecuador, they're from Colombia, they're from Peru, they're from all these countries, and they want to lump them into one particular group that is a
Listen,
racial group.
the funny thing that I can say is us as Afro Latino has much more in common being from different countries, nations,
Yes,
political states, than the Latinos in general. So,
yes,
like the
that's
culture
true.
from Argentina to the culture of Mexico is totally different, right? The country culture of each country is very peculiar. But us, African Americans, then I would say the term Americans from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, right? That also is an argument that I have sometimes with people about being American. When I say I'm American, I'm Brazilian. So,
Yes,
uh, because here too, something that irks us that how to all Latin Americans, how Americans took over uh, to be called Americans because, right?
yes. The
Uh,
Americas is more
he,
than one continent.
yeah,
Yes,
here you
yes.
guys are estadounidenses, United Statens, United
Right.
Statens. That's your nationality. So,
But
but
I
yeah,
think
as
yeah.
all this
Your point is well taken.
dispersed African population, we are much more cohesive culturally, because also our richness is not that we look alike, we are brown and we, in different shades, but our culture, it's like from the culture of Bahia and Cuba, it's almost mirrored. You know, they in the way of speaking to the Spanish and the Portuguese, the use of diminutives, you know, the candomblé or the santeria, you know, and so the spirit of pan-Africanism is so latent, you know, to be activated, and we just need to know about this, about each other, and be more aware of these great similarities that we have, because
And I
many
think that's
times
yet. Yeah.
we see the African American, I mean the African United Statesians, uh, more distant, you know, and and I think would benefit more if more people from the black people from the United States reach and come here. Because as far as I understand, I heard in a class once that 2/3 of black people in the United States are descendants of slaves that did not came directly from Africa, but they came from the many broken rebellions in South America, particularly in Brazil,
Hmm.
you know, that they were sold because the slave trade was abolished in the beginning of the 19th century. So the transatlantic slave trade was banished, but not the inter-American slave trade.
Hmm.
You know, so
And also, many
uh,
came via the Caribbean as well, because there weren't slave ships that always came directly. They would stop and then pick up, and so you and this sense of mixing, that in order to ensure that there would not be slave rebellions, they would put people from different language groups together so that they would not have the ability initially to speak to each other or to communicate with each other. So when you look at the DNA profile, like mine, I have something like 8 different countries that
yeah,
8 or 9 different countries that seem to have some element inside of me, right? And so I think it's
exactly.
important. Yes, it's important. And I think the concept of the African diaspora, because what we do share is regardless of what country we came through, because of that transatlantic slave, we are always at the bottom of the scale, always at the bottom of the
That's,
social scale. That is what binds us to across geography.
But
and
is
the one
that the
thing that
biggest part?
also that we should sometimes remember, there was two waves of
Mm,
enslaved people brought in. So us, you, me, all, we are descendant of that wave from the 19th century that
hmm.
were mostly Yoruba, but the slavery in America started in 1545 or 51, I don't remember.
Yes,
They were mainly Bantus, you know.
yes.
Later they switched it, and principally in the 19th century was the strong quantity of people that come from the Gold Coast, as they would
Hmm.
call, or so, and some from Mozambique. But
Yoji, let me jump in for a second. I was
mhm,
just sort of thinking about your questioning and the use of the word African American and how language and labels, we use. And what
yeah,
I heard you saying is that uh, Black people, Africans in North America, sort of improperly see themselves as Americans, and Black people throughout the rest of the hemisphere, they question their Americanness. That's a consequence of socialization and the colonial mindset uh, that we experience and have and were enslaved under in North America. But I, somewhere this might not add up, but let me throw it out anyway. I was recalling an interview I did with a gentleman named General Riek Machar. Riek Machar was the
Sudan.
Machar, vice commander
Mm-hmm.
of the Sudanese People's Liberation Army and vice
Mm-hmm.
chair of the Sudanese People's Liberation Movement. And in the
I think he's
interview,
the vice president.
and today he's vice president of South Sudan. In the interview, he was telling me that he was explaining the difference between the people of the South that he was a part of. He was a New Era, I think, and the people in Khartoum who were Egypt facing, and he called them, you know, uh, Arabized Africans. And so I was intrigued by the language, the description. I said, "Well, what is an Arabized African? What do you mean? I mean, who are they? How do they look?" And he said, "They look like you, Al McFarlane. They look like you, and these are people that obviously have African Black ancestry origins, but over time they have been uh, genetically altered and in a sense mentally altered as well, so that they see themselves connected to Arabia more than to the Africa that is their origin." And so that's kind of, it was an aha moment for me. I still haven't fully assessed what it means, but it has some part to do with this conversation.
But
That's
I
what I
think
know. Irma,
let
go ahead.
let let me just say is I think that the trouble we have as people from the United States is that we cannot reconcile. Black people in the United States have spent centuries trying to become part of the nation state.
Mhm.
So we don't necessarily embrace our national identity. Therefore, when we meet people from countries like Brazil and Cuba, they are part of the national identity. They see themselves as Brazilians. Okay. Whereas we are always sort of reduced to that biological category of blackness versus American. And I think the attempt, the name change of African American was an attempt to try and reconcile that, to situate ourselves in the American national identity as people of African descent. Now, whether we were successful or not, because the state also has to accept you. And while I would say there's no conflict with people, with Brazilians like Yoji calling himself a Brazilian, the state is not saying, no, you're not Brazilian, you know. And I
Yeah.
think that for us is a very hard thing to have to understand, because we have always been trying to become part of that national identity and we've been rejected from it,
And I come out of
in
that
that sense.
conversation saying, should I begin to call myself an Americanized African as opposed to an African American? Uh, just as he called the people in Khartoum Arabized Africans, am I therefore an Americanized or
Well,
Europeanized
we're all
African?
socialized by the dominant culture. We all
Sure.
drink the Kool-Aid. There's no way to escape that in that sense. But I think it's how we either choose to embrace the oppressive way in which we're perceived, or we turn it on its head and we create our own construct of identity that gives us some sense of empowerment. And so people outside are always going to come and say to Black Americans, why didn't you do this? Because they have no understanding of how racism and structural racism operates. So it's okay for them to critique us and say, you should have been able to do this, you should have had access to that, because they don't understand that being a native born Black American is, people have a preference for other Blacks outside of native borns. And
Mhm.
so they will promote them and support them in ways that they do not support native born. And people need to understand that's what structural racism does, in
Yoji,
that sense.
Yoji, did you see that or experience that or witness that as a Brazilian coming to United States? What was the difference? And I say that because I know the difference that my father experienced as a Cuban and as a Jamaican coming to the U.S. from other members in our family who were born here. And the structure, the social structure, the city, the government made a difference for my father that it did not make for my mother. My mother out of Mississippi. What was your
Yeah.
experience?
Well, I used to do a lot of after school programs and work in school. Was a very recurrent uh, question that little kids would make to me. They would say, "What are you? Are you black?" you know, and I was like, "Ah, it's not obvious." but I think because probably of my accent, and maybe some other cultural things, how to do things. But part what Dr. Irma was saying, it's right. Sometimes we have a say here, né, that says, "Santo de casa não faz milagre." Home saint doesn't do miracles. So I did find, in certain ways, some moments that I was favored
Mhm.
in certain situations in relationship to a Native American born black because of being a foreigner,
Mhm.
and many times was like with a wink from like you are different from them, kind of,
Mhm. Mhm.
and
Mhm.
but this replicates, I think, also everywhere. For example, an African United Statesians here in
Mhm.
Brazil, you have
Right.
you're gonna be like overwhelmed by attention and opportunities
Yes.
because
Agreed.
you are a foreigner,
Mhm.
That's
gringo. So
right.
also you become a gringo, black gringo, So
Yes. Yes.
it's more
But many of us.
sometimes.
Mhm.
I think sometimes it's more, the foreigner. Like me here, people say that I came back, que eu voltei americanizado, that I'm
Aha.
Americanized in certain things, you know, or they
But
identify
I
like
think
you
it's
from
important.
here.
I think it's important to understand that some of the privileges we associate with things like affirmative action, if you go and look at the actual data of places like Harvard that say, oh, well, we have 12% Black students, many of those are people whose ancestry is in the Caribbean, not native born. And I've actually had people argue with me in terms of what my origins are because it is impossible for them to reconcile that someone whose roots are native born could have accomplished the things I've accomplished. So they will say, so where are you from? Or where are your people from? I say, Alabama, Mississippi. They say, yeah, but where are they from? As if somehow it was impossible for someone who is native born completely to have done all the things I have done. So there's still that tension. But I agree with you, Yoji, is that when I go to Paris, I know that my experience as a Black American is going to be very different from those who were native born, in that country and who are Black. And I think that's what we have to recognize is that we do walk with privilege when we go outside of this country. And I think more of us need to go outside so that we can
Oh
understand
yeah.
the conditions of other people of African descent globally.
So where do we stand now? We got about 4 minutes to wrap up here. I'm so interested in what you and I, Yoji, are doing in bringing online the project Afrodescendientes, where we are, with intention, uh, sharing simple stories, brief stories, but in a multiplicity of languages, or creating a story and translating it on the newspaper page into Spanish, Portuguese, English, Yoruba, Swahili, um, and French, I think, French.
Mhm.
Yes.
And it's an experiment in journalism from my point of view, but I think that there's value in creating this idea that we show up in this variety of idioms, that we are owners and creators of these communication strategy styles, tools, vocabularies. What does that really mean for the new world that is formed by our ability to be in touch with each other in ways we have not before because of travel, technology, etc. Yoji, you first, and Irma, you can wrap it up with that.
Well, I think we are in a situation that we never have been before, as I was trying to say the last show that I was in, that we do have now tools to, in certain way, implement this idea of Pan-Africanism, to look for our brothers and sisters. They are everywhere, and I would say this community of this diaspora, you find a African descent person in any place now in the world. If he's not a Brazilian, he's a Nigerian, he's an American. So we have these unique opportunities that technology is giving us to be in contact with our contemporaries and be able to find answers, meaningful answers that are not speculations, they are not in many times theories, by having some form of direct contact with our people throughout the world. You know,
We got
there is
about 2 minutes left. Irma,
Afro-Iranians, there are Afro-Indians.
let me shift to Irma for the last 2 minutes. Irma, you can close
Yes,
this.
I think I have about 2 minutes left on my battery. I would say that what this column does is to expose readers, particularly Black American readers, to the fact that there is such a range of Blackness in the world. And for those people who can't afford a passport, who can't afford to go and travel to the country directly, they can read in multiple languages, and maybe it will inspire them to learn a different language and to go and look up more. And so I hope it continues, because I think it's like a journalistic passport, if you will, to a window, if you will, onto other forms of Blackness and what Blackness looks like. And it doesn't always look like what it does in the United States.
45 seconds.
Perfect.
Irma, what are you reading? Anything new?
Oh, geez, no. I'm
Uh,
just trying to catch up with everything that I
yeah.
haven't read before.
Listen, we're out of time. Yoji, thank you so much. Dr. Irma McClaurin, thank you. I'm Al
Thank you.
McFarlane. The conversation. We'll see you next time.